Almost 1,000 years ago, a man assembled an armada of 15,000 warriors. He had made Normandy a rich, powerful land. But hatred was at his door. Mocked, detested, and envied, his burning ambition led him to formulate a wild yet meticulously planned scheme to invade England and become king. For this, he would go down in history as William the Conqueror. What remains of his story? Largely erased, forgotten, and left in ruins, traces do remain. Thus, the line between one man's dream and historic reality becomes blurred.
It could be a bit higher, but it's not bad. Yes, the neck was totally bare. We can see their shaven necks on the Bayeux tapestry. It probably helped when wearing the helmet or the headgear that went underneath.
Our story begins with a little riddle. The exact date of William's birth has never been known, but it is commonly accepted that he was born around 1027. What we know for certain is that he was raised in Falaise in Normandy, in the castle of his father, Robert the Magnificent. As the Duke of Normandy, his father had influence. His mother, Arlette, however, was a local girl with no noble blood. William was therefore considered a bastard. What was going on at this grandiose ceremony? What was Robert the Magnificent's plan?
Before setting off on a pilgrimage, Robert the Magnificent, the Duke who ruled Normandy from 1030 to 1035, officially enthroned little William when he was only 7. He inherited a duchy with, theoretically, the recognition of nobles, but they did not uphold their commitment.
Un genou à terre, mes lèvres lui diront ma soumission. Et déjà mon cœur n'est animé que d'un rêve. Abattre Guillaume le Bâtard.
Upon the death of Robert the Magnificent, the Normans contested young William for 2 reasons. Firstly, because he was a bastard. It wasn't as fashionable as in the previous century, when practically all the dukes of Normandy were of illegitimate birth. Secondly, because he was a child, and certain ambitious uncles of William were staking their claim to power. At one point, around 1045, they tried to assassinate him in Valognes.
Seigneur d'Arc, de Brionne et de Tesson, jurons ici au péril de notre vie d'abattre Guillaume et de le laisser mort. Sur notre âme, nous le jurons.
Luckily, a jester in Valognes, a close friend of William, called Gaulle, overheard the would-be assassins and their accomplices plotting. He went straight to wake the Duke in his bed and ordered him to leave as quickly as possible, taking only a cloak and jump on his horse or be murdered in a matter of minutes. William fled and rode all night towards Falaise. He must have crossed the ford of the Baie des Vets, which was extremely dangerous. He must have crossed the Bessin, avoiding the towns where accomplices may be waiting. He also crossed the forest of Brocheville.
This flight helped forge the myth of William as young, brave, and headstrong. A bastard and a loner, capable of riding 150 kilometers with killers at his heels. Texts of the time transform this event into legend, but struggle to authenticate the details. Was William's horse spooked? Perhaps William was unseated. What if there never was a river to cross? What can historians say with certainty? In fact, just what do we know about William? It was all so long ago. What was he really like?
We obviously have portraits of William from the 14th, 15th, 19th centuries, even statues like the one in Falaise. And this is a more or less romantic vision of the character, not based on anything historical. William never doubted his own legitimacy. Most of the dukes of Normandy came from illegitimate marriages. Consequently, he was totally in line with his ancestors and considered that those who challenged his legitimacy were rebels, and that it was his duty to punish them for that. William took refuge in Falaise, and there, aged 18, took his first political initiative. He called upon his suzerain, the King of France, and with his help, was able to bring down the accomplices who wanted to take his power. That was the Battle of Valesdune.
William and the king faced between 1,000 and 2,000 warriors commanded by the rebel barons with the bewitching names Renulf de Brixard, Grimoald de Plessis, and Amand le Dentu.
Historians consider that it was a great battle and a chance for William to prove his worth. They even say that the fighting was so terrible and the massacre on such a scale that the river Orne ran red with blood. William settled in Caen, where he built his castle, making the town the capital of Lower Normandy.
It's hard to pick one's way through this warren of ruins today. What here dates back to William? The ramparts, the ditches, the keep, the artillery terrace are just a succession of changes wrought through the centuries. Yet on the ground there are traces that give us a clue as to what the castle and the town might have been like around the year 1000. Perhaps a castle, peace, wealth. All that was missing from the perfect picture was a wife.
Je suis le duc de Normandie et je veux embrasser ma femme.
William and Matilda formed a couple unlike most others in the Middle Ages. All their lives, they were faithful to one another, and William had no known mistress nor bastard. He chose Matilda, daughter of the Count of Flanders, one of the most powerful figures of the time. Matilda was a descendant of the kings of France, the Carolingians, so the bastard was marrying into the highest royal line.
De haute lignée royale.
Dépêchez-vous, il y a 200 personnes qui vous attendent.
News of the marriage was heard in Rome, where Pope Leo IX did not accept it for reasons of fifth-degree consanguinity between William and Matilda. He therefore banned the marriage. But that did not stop William from marrying Matilda, either in 1050 or in 1051, in Eu, on the edge of the Duchy of Normandy.
William was a builder. He and Matilda built the men's abbey and the women's abbey in Caen, acts of allegiance that must have gone down well in Rome with Pope Nicholas II, with whom William had made his peace. Could we imagine that William's story ends here? Good husband and father, pious Christian, occasional builder, could William have become a provincial nobleman?
No, there was no room for routine. The surprise, when it came came from England. Edward the Confessor took the throne after a 28-year exile in Normandy. He had no heir, and so he chose William to succeed him.
Thus he overlooked his English brother-in-law, Harold.
In 1064, Harold set sail to come and meet William. And when he landed on the Ponthieu coast to the north of Normandy, he was taken prisoner, and William ordered his release. It was at that time, in fact, that the Bayeux Tapestry was begun.
A treasure of humanity, a treasure trove for any historian, a work of propaganda, as well as a powerful testimony of the manners of the time. The Bayeux Tapestry also told of what was to come, of the upheaval in William's life, and far more besides.
We know the Bayeux Tapestry was exhibited in early July every year for the Feast of Relics in Bayeux Cathedral. It was laid out in the nave so as to be completely visible to the public who came to the cathedral.
The crowd jostles to relive the adventures of William and Harold. Here they are, setting off to wage war together in Brittany.
It seems that a friendship grew between the two men, but William was wary of Harold's ambition and asked him to swear on the relics to promise to back his claim to the throne of England. This oath was probably sworn in the crypt of Bayeux Cathedral.
1,000 years on, the crypt is still there, identical, aside from paintings that an untrained eye might think were of that period, but which were actually added 400 years later. The text of the oath was authenticated, transcribed according to the testimonies of several who took part in the ceremony.
Per hunc sacramentum, ego Harold.
By this oath, I, Harold, will be the representative of Duke William at the court of my lord, King Edward, as long as he shall live. I shall do all in my power so that after Edward's death, the kingdom of England be handed to him.
Per immixtionem manuum te militem accipio.
Back in London, Harold soon witnessed the last moments of Edward the Confessor, who, on his deathbed, entrusted the Kingdom of England to Harold.
He was a weak king who had promised his throne to several figures, so much so that several figures might feel legitimate. We have reason to think that at the last moment, the moment of his death, he designated Harold as his successor, as the tapestry shows.
Edward died on January 5th, and the very next day Harold had himself crowned king. The news traveled very fast in England and immediately went to Normandy, thanks to the great number of spies on English soil. So William was quickly informed.
Édouard est mort et Harold s'est fait couronner roi, malgré son serment. Usurpateur. Parjure. Usurpateur. Parjure. Usurpateur! Parjure! Usurpateur et parjure!
One can ask whether Harold really did go back on his word. Some dispute it, but it does merit discussion.
There are, in fact, quite a few sources on the subject from the quills of medieval authors, penned in the scriptori of monasteries. Among them, William of Poitiers, William of Jumièges, and the Anglo-Norman monk Orderic Vital.
And we have another version, that of Vasse, a Norman author who wrote the Roman de Roux. Vasse's account was written a century after the events, but he relied on the testimony of his father, who was present at the Battle of Hastings, and gives us information that we don't get from other sources.
The Duke was delighted. He was happy with the flag and the permission given him by the Pope. He sent for blacksmiths and carpenters. Building materials were hauled in. Wood brought, dowels were shaped, planks were planed, boats and ships were fitted out, sails were set, masts were mounted. A lot of bodies were busied, lots of money spent. It took the whole summer and harvest time to fit out the fleet and raise the troops.
In the second half of April, an exceptional event happened in the western sky.
Que signifie ce signe dans le ciel?
Je sais pas.
Ma, non capisco.
Hé, toi le flamand!
Ik weet het niet, ik heb nog nooit zoiets gezien.
We now know it was Halley's Comet. It shone in the sky for a fortnight. To the people of the time, it foretold of a calamity, a shift in the destiny of kingdoms.
Pour son seigneur! Doit-on souffrir comment?
The presence of Taillefer, a rather excitable character, endlessly shouting the Song of Roland, was recorded by Vasse, the Norman historian.
Et moi, de Durandal!
Taillefer, who sang so well, preceded the Duke, singing of the exploits of Charlemagne, Roland and his vassals who died at Roncevaux.
Ce fut l'épée d'un bon soldat.
Still playing at war, but not yet with any conviction, William moved his pawns further north to Saint-Valery in the Baie de Somme, still waiting for a favorable wind.
Les hommes sont venus de loin, parfois de très loin, pour vous rejoindre. Ils sont prêts à se battre, mais l'inaction leur pèse. Les cas d'insubordination et d'indiscipline se multiplient.
Ces hommes sont tous volontaires. Que ceux qui veulent renoncer partent, nous n'avons que faire des faibles.
Vous devez annoncer ou que l'expédition est reportée au printemps prochain ou que nous embarquons demain. Sinon, tout ce à quoi vous avez travaillé pendant des mois sera un fiasco.
Au prochain printemps, ce sera trop tard. Et demain, c'est trop tôt. La traversée sera un succès, mais nous devons attendre encore.
William stayed 2 weeks in the Baie de Somme and waited for a favorable blowing from the English side.
Souffle du côté de l'Angleterre.
On the morning of September 28th, the wind turned and allowed William to embark.
Mes amis! Dieu a décidé que l'heure est venue de rendre la justice! Ah!
For a historian who has dedicated his life to the saga of William, the crossing of the Channel by the Norman Armada remains a moment to be endlessly pondered and reimagined.
Bien, messieurs, dans quelques quelques instants, nous entrerons dans le tunnel sous la Manche. La traversée prendra une vingtaine de minutes environ. A few moments we're entering the tunnel canal transit.
Mes amis, l'heure est proche. Nous allons prendre ce qui est à nous. Vous êtes prêts, mes Normands? Dioxide! Dioxide!
Nobody expected the Norman landing.
Au débarquement, et justement,
That was part of William's plan.
partie du programme de Guillaume.
He knew that Harold had sent all his troops north to face the Norwegians. And at Stamford Bridge, on September 25th, there was a terrible battle where virtually all the Norwegians were slaughtered.
Pratiquement tous les Norvégiens ont été éliminés. Et justement,
William took advantage of this absence of troops in the south to land unhindered.
pour débarquer en toute tranquillité. Il débarque
He landed on Pevensey Beach.
de Pévincé. Dès le lendemain,
The next day, the infantry set off across the fields, while William's fleet made for a little harbor at the foot of Hastings Cliffs.
petit port au pied de la falaise d'Hastings.
From that point on, the little village of Hastings has owed its universal renown through the ages to William. On the English side, the men with long hair gathered by the famous gray apple tree. Tired but galvanized by their victory against the Norwegians, they readied themselves to take up arms yet again.
The army of King Harold was akin to what we normally consider to be the feudal army. There were two main parts to it. One were his own household, which was essentially the aristocracy of England, who held their land on the basis of military service and personal loyalty to King Harold. And they are usually called the housecarls of the king. But crucially, in battle, they didn't fight on horseback like cavalry normally fight. They dismounted and they fought with the sword and the axe like the Norman infantry. Alongside the housecarls, there was the Anglo-Saxon word third, in other words, the feudal levies, and the words are linked, who were the normal country people of England who owed their own tenure to their lords, who owed their tenure to the king. They had the duty of turning out for so many months or so many weeks every year to fight for the king. And one of the problems with Harold's army, as indeed with feudal armies later on, is that that right only lasted for 6 weeks or 2 months. So there was a point at which the third was called, was assembled, was ready to fight, and after so many months, he went home again. So Harold had some limitations there. It's probable that if Harold had waited 2, 3, 4 days, and no more than that, to assemble a force that was significantly bigger and significantly better rested than the force he actually fielded at Hastings, then he might have triumphed, and English history would look rather different.
The English were shrewdly encamped at the top of the hill, which overlooked the plain by some 40 meters. And William had naturally camped at the foot of this hill to be able to maneuver.
Seigneur Guillaume, je vous ai longtemps et fidèlement servi. Pour toute récompense, je vous demande ceci. Accordez-moi le premier coup de la bataille.
Va, Taillefer. Je te dois bien ce prix. Et si tu meurs, c'est nous qui chanterons ta gloire.
La bataille a commencé.
The battle began at 9 in the morning, as William de Poitiers tells us.
Les Normands
The Normans first deployed their archers.
leurs archers qui vont s'avancer le plus près
They sent them in as close as possible, but hardly were they within an arrow's range, around 40 to 50 meters,
40 à 50 mètres.
then spears rained down on them from the hill, killing a good many men. William saw then he would obtain nothing with his archers and sent in his infantrymen.
The battlefield sheds light on the customs of the time. We find that William's half-brother Odo swapped his cassock for a chainmail suit. As a bishop, he didn't have the right to shed blood, so his sword was forbidden, but a club was tolerated.
For around 1.5 to 2 hours, William had both his infantry and cavalry attack the hill. But they couldn't gain a foothold, as they were hindered by the hail of spears and shafts of all kinds hurled by the English. William de Poitiers, William the Conqueror's biographer, said the cloud of projectiles was so dense it blocked out the sun's rays. Perhaps an exaggeration for the sake of the epic, but it shows that the English were able to keep the Normans at bay. And that's what they did for the first couple of hours. What happened next was an incident stemming from a bold maneuver that the Bretons were charged with performing. They advanced as close as possible to the English flank, and at a given moment, they provoked what is known as a feigned flight.
It was a ruse. William's soldiers appeared to turn back, to retreat from the shield wall of the Anglo-Saxon housecarls, which hitherto had been impregnable. So the pretense on the part of the Normans to give up, to retreat, to run away, tested the discipline of the Anglo-Saxon army to breaking point. And there was a moment when they broke their wall, they ran down the hill, and of course, by doing that, they exposed themselves to attack by men on horses armed with lances, and were extremely vulnerable.
William, who had advanced on his horse to direct the highly delicate feigned flight maneuver, was held up because his horse was killed by an English spear. The horse collapsed and rolled on top of William the Conqueror.
William's fall became one of the great dramatic moments of the Battle of Hastings. As a knight, it's something you'd be keen to tell your beloved when you were reunited after the fighting. Here, William becomes his own historian.
On me croit mort. La fausse fuite de mes valeureux Bretons entraîne la fuite de toute l'armée qui croit tout perdu. Si je n'interviens pas très vite, ce sera un désastre dans lequel nombre d'hommes périront en vain. Il me faut renverser le cours du destin. Je me relève. Sans prendre le temps de parler, je renverse le chevalier le plus proche de moi. J'enfourche son cheval.
It was as if nothing else existed but the epic of a hero whom fate has pitched alone against the world.
Je retire mon casque et je montre à tous que je suis bien vivant. Voyez-moi tous. Dieu aidant, je vaincrai. Vous abandonnez la victoire pour courir à votre perte et à une perpétuelle infamie. Quel chemin s'ouvre à votre retraite? Si vous fuyez, aucun de vous n'échappera à la mort. Alors les fuyards font demi-tour.
Et là, vraisemblablement...
And probably a new phase began then, identical to the first. That is, that William relaunched his archers, his infantry, and his cavalry. And we can say that from 1 or 2 o'clock until 3 in the afternoon, William met with the same failure.
C'est le même échec pour Guillaume.
They needed to clear the battlefield, to take away the corpses, the dead horses, the wounded, to restock with weapons, spears, arrows, and all kinds of lances. They also had to regroup a certain number of forces to enable them to mount another attack.
One of the problems with Harold's army was the lack of archers. And it's very difficult to explain that because archery was a perfectly common thing in England, just as it was in Normandy. And one of the, not strategic, but tactical advantages William had, as we all know, was the large company of archers he brought with him and the effect they had on the battle.
If we look carefully at the Bayeux tapestry, we see that there's a character called Harold who gets an arrow in the eye, and just next to him is a knight amputating another character's leg. That's a second representation of Harold.
And once the king was dead, the idea of the state in Anglo-Saxon England was not strong enough to hold this mass of people together. So with the death of the king, all loyalty to a common cause breaks apart and disintegrates. And at that point, the dispersal of the English army is inevitable. There's no one there to hold them together. The king and his 2 brothers have both been killed, and the Normans rule the field.
It is hard to evaluate losses on either side. We know both sides suffered severe losses, probably around 3,000 dead on the English side, 2,000 dead among the Normans, Bretons, and French. So it was probably a very hard battle, which lasted from 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening. It was one of the great battles of the Middle Ages, which obviously changed the fate of England. From that moment on, instead of hurrying towards London, William made an encircling maneuver, continuing his butchery and setting fires to terrorize the population. And what he expected to happen, happened. The aristocrats and the inhabitants of London came out to surrender when William approached the city.
Here the sources differ quite significantly. And my own belief is that London didn't surrender as easily as it is usually assumed, and that there was actually a siege of London. In other words, London was captured by assault and not simply by surrender. So the Roman walls of London and defended by the Anglo-Saxon nobility in support of Edgar the Atheling, the Anglo-Saxon claimant to the throne once Harold was dead, put up a pretty fierce resistance. It's slightly surprising that we don't hear more about the siege of London in the Chronicles, and the really sad thing is that the Bayeux tapestry is cut off at the wrong moment. And I suspect it's true that the Bayeux tapestry actually had another 20 foot showing the capture of London at the end of it.
A dizzying example of Saga's propaganda, the tapestry made no mention of any looting, rape, and murder by the Norman army. It omitted the bloody siege of London and consigned to oblivion the moving coronation of William on the throne of England, which was nonetheless carefully rehearsed and staged to avoid any mishap.
Ô Sérénissime Guillaume,
grand et pacifique roi, couronné par Dieu. Je jure, fidélité. Fidélité. Vous comprenez pourquoi vous devez apprendre ce texte en anglais. Puis, vous irez vous asseoir sur ce fauteuil qui vous attendra. Et Monseigneur Eldred vous présentera le sceptre et la couronne. Le sceptre et la couronne. Demain. Demain, le sceptre et la couronne attendront demain. N'ouvrons pas la porte à quelque malheur en posant cette couronne sur votre tête ce soir.
Why did William want to come so much? Why did he make this huge effort to capture England? Because England was very rich. The City of London was already a very important international port because the kings of England had had to pay off the Danes all the time with Danegeld. They were very good at raising taxes. They actually raised the money, revenues from their land. So it was a very attractive land for William.
The population of London was the biggest of any English city, so large areas within the Roman walls were open land, they were vegetable gardens, they were fields, there were churches, there was some vestige of the Roman street plan, but not very much. But actually, most of the commerce of London took place in an area which was outside the walls, to the west of London, which is called by the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and by archaeologists today, London Wick. And that is where the main centre of commerce and population existed. And then just further west of that, there was Westminster Palace. And that's where the political power and the commercial power actually lay.
As the city of London was a key piece of the puzzle, heavily populated, and William feared a revolt, he immediately built fortifications. The biggest was called the Tower of London.
It's an absolutely magnificent building. He builds it in the corner of the Roman wall at London. The corner, the eastern corner, so that it dominates both the city, and it would be enormously dominant to anyone who approached London by ship up the River Thames. So they would come along the Thames, imagine merchants from the Empire, from Scandinavia, from France, ambassadors coming from, say, the Emperor or Flanders. They would come up the Thames and they would see this magnificent building. It was built out of Caen stone, and we know that it was lime-washed. That's why it was called the White Tower. The one side that wasn't magnificent was the north side, which didn't really matter. And all the toilets were designed so that they gave out onto the north side. So the entire tower is this magnificent white tower, but I'm afraid on the north side would have been rather spoiled by the effects of guardrobes. But they didn't worry about that. What matters is the three facades that people were really supposed to see. And it was tucked into a bit of the Roman wall. He used the Roman wall, which still existed, almost as if William was Caesar.
And it's undoubtedly true that one of the reasons why the Norman conquest was a success was the proliferation of castles during William's lifetime, during the first years after the conquest, on the initiative especially of the king and his great nobles such as William Fitz-Osbern, William de Warenne and so on, who built castles to control England in a very, very solid kind of way. And their example was taken up by the lesser nobility as decade followed decade. After William's death, more were built. And by 1100, it's believed that there were about 500 castles in England, whereas before 1066, there had been about 5.
William's problem was that he couldn't be in Normandy and England at the same time. When he was in England, the Normans never actually rebelled, but often those from Le Mans, Angers, and the Bretons did. Conversely, when he was in Normandy, he managed to quell any revolt, but the Scots and the Welsh were busy attacking England.
There were incessant revolts, and the Norman yoke was mercilessly applied. There were massacres, particularly in the north, and for 3 years, William went from one region to the next with an army to massacre the population, sometimes an innocent population. We can say that by 1072, order had been restored, but it was an order imposed by terror.
William was becoming old. He'd grown fat and had lost the confidence of those around him.
His half-brother Odo was William the Conqueror's right-hand man for years. Each time William came to Normandy, he played the role of viceroy, who governed in the name of the king. So he was an important character. No doubt not well liked because he was very authoritarian. He prized wealth and riches, but he nevertheless governed England efficiently. But there came a time when he took too much liberty with the king. We're not absolutely sure of the circumstances, but it seems he wanted to set off on his own expedition to Rome, perhaps to overthrow the Pope, perhaps to be elected Pope. We don't really know.
Mon frère, à qui j'avais confié le soin de mon royaume, a opprimé les pauvres pour un espoir frivole. Il a détaché de mon service un grand nombre de chevaliers.
When William found out, he was appalled. The scene happened on the Isle of Wight. He was about to set sail, and William caught him on the Isle of Wight and ordered that his brother be arrested as a rebel.
Saisissez-vous de cet homme qui trouble la paix.
But nobody dared touch him because he was such an important figure.
Nul ne peut condamner un évêque sans le jugement du pape.
So William himself seized his brother's shoulder and said,
Ce n'est pas l'évêque que j'arrête, mais le comte de Kent qui dépend de moi. Sortez! Sortez tous!
And he was arrested, imprisoned in Rouen, and remained in prison until William's death, so for 5 years, from 1082 to 1087.
Toi aussi, l'enfant.
His whole reign stretched over 20 years, between 1066 and 1086. So as he came to the end of his reign, he felt the need to know his kingdom better, for all sorts of reasons. In particular, for fiscal reasons, to know what sums were owed by such and such a lord, such and such an estate, or such and such a town. So he proceeded with a great survey. He sent his investigators to every county in England, and the result of this survey was written down in a great book called, in English, the Doomsday Book, which means the Book of the Last Judgment. So King William was able to know his people down to the very last inhabitant, like Christ at the final judgment.
The Doomsday Book can also be summarized as a rather bizarre inventory. Mr. Smith owns a dozen rabbits. There are 2,500 pigs in Chester. Miss Charleston's hens did not lay any eggs in the year of our Lord 1072. 3 calves drowned in Grimsby. Mr. Wesson's 80 cows produced 1,000 liters of milk. There goes a horse. The town of Lewes has 412 inhabitants. Southampton, 5,433. Liverpool, 2,987.
On November 1st, 1083, Matilda died in Caen. She was buried at the Ladies' Abbey that she founded. This was dreadful news to William. His faithful collaborator left him alone with conflicts to resolve, in particular with one of his sons, the eldest, Robert Courteuse.
Taille! Taille! On va. Ah! On va. Quand vas-tu te décider à aller chez le barbier, mon fils? Faudra-t-il que je le fasse moi-même?
In the autumn of his life, William entered into conflict with the King of France, who was now Philip I, son of Henry I, who wanted to win back part of the Vexin that had been yielded to the Normans. This was a border region that had long been disputed between France and Normandy. And in 1087, William attempted an operation to seize the Vexin.
Qu'a dit le roi de France?
Le roi de France, Seigneur Guillaume, a appris que...
Qu'a-t-il appris?
Que vous ne pouvez plus guerroyer. Et
va-t-il falloir que je t'arrache les mots de la bouche?
Pardonnez-moi, Seigneur Guillaume. Le roi de France a demandé si le gros Guillaume allait bientôt accoucher.
Quand j'irai faire mes relevailles, c'est sur ces terres que je les ferai. J'irai à Notre-Dame de Paris avec 10 000 lances en guise de cierge.
During an expedition to the French Vexin, William had an accident. His horse reared up, and he was wounded in the stomach by the pommel of his saddle. Transported to Rouen, his capital, it took him about a week to die. He retained his lucidity until the end. Orderic Vital had him deliver a long speech in which he admitted all his faults and distributed his inheritance, choosing William Rufus, his younger son, as his heir, not his eldest son, Robert Courteuse. So William was a politician until the very end.
La couronne, mon fils. Je ne peux vous la donner moi-même. Car c'est injustement que j'ai conquis l'Angleterre.
Selon Orderic Vital,
according to Orderic Vital, William owned up on his deathbed to conquering England unfairly.
De façon injuste.
But this wasn't in William's nature. He had too high an opinion of his mission and his legitimacy to reassess his reign in this way, particularly his conquest of England. Here, one must concede that Orderic Vital perhaps added a little romance to the story.
Ce que j'ai acquis moi-même, au prix de tant de crimes, je le remets à Dieu seul. Seul l'archevêque de Canterbury pourra vous transmettre la couronne légalement. Appuyez-vous sur l'archevêque dans vos décisions. Hein? C'est le plus loyal des hommes. L'enfant m'a toujours fidèlement servi. Et il saura vous conseiller. Qu'est-ce que ce bruit?
C'est l'office de Notre-Dame, Guillaume. que la mère de Dieu me recommande à son fils.
At that moment, panic spread throughout the house. All the barons fled, as well as the clerks. The servants left, taking the crockery. William remained alone on his deathbed.
Sur son lit de mort. Une fois mort, il a fallu le faire.
His body had to be taken by sea to Caen, as he wished to be buried in the abbey he founded in Saint-Étienne de Caen.
William's tomb contains yet another riddle. Why have the Conqueror say that he regretted claiming the throne of England? Was this an intuition of what was to come? It is said, who can say if it's true, that the ghosts of Matilda and William sometimes wander the throne room like lost souls. But some things we do know for certain, that Normandy lost its sovereignty and was definitively incorporated into the throne of France in 1204. That the Normans who had settled in England took wives, and their descendants became English. That 250 years after the death of William, England invaded Normandy, launching a war that lasted 100 years. And that in 1944, 878 years after William, the British and their allies finally landed in Normandy, recreating the Normans' exploit in the opposite direction and on a far greater scale.